Good evening, Nightmare Society members, and welcome to a journey into the darkest corners of America. I'm your host, and tonight we're exploring 5 chilling tales where true crime meets supernatural horror. Stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare. What makes these stories particularly unsettling isn't just the violence or the mystery, it's how they unfold in places we're supposed to feel safe. Small towns with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors. Communities where everyone knows everyone, where doors are left unlocked and where strangers are welcomed with warm smiles and homemade casseroles. But as we'll discover tonight, that very intimacy, that sense of belonging and community trust, can become the perfect camouflage for unspeakable horrors. When an entire town becomes complicit in evil, when the people meant to protect you are the very ones hunting you, when the familiar becomes terrifyingly foreign, that's when you realize that sometimes the most dangerous place to be is exactly where you thought you belonged. Tonight's stories feature a preservation society with a deadly agenda, an art collection that demands living subjects, a congregation with an appetite for their shepherds, a youth program that erases souls, and a professor whose research goes far beyond the classroom. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for 5 tales of true crime horror, where the real monsters don't hide in shadows. They sit on town councils, lead church committees, and teach in prestigious universities. Where evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare, it simply smiles and says, "Welcome to our community." Story 1. The Millbrook Preservation Society. Detective Sarah Chen had seen her share of crime scenes in Chicago, but nothing prepared her for what awaited in Millbrook, population 847, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual corn festival. She'd taken the job as the town's first full-time detective 6 months ago, hoping for a quieter life. The irony wasn't lost on her now as she stood before the Hendricks farmhouse, watching the forensics team work by the harsh glare of portable lights. The call had come in at 3:47 a.m. Mrs. Eleanor Hendricks, 73, found dead in her kitchen, her body positioned in an unnatural tableau, seated at her dining table with a cup of tea growing cold, her hands folded neatly, eyes closed as if sleeping. But the ligature marks around her neck and the staging told a different story. "Third one this month," muttered Deputy Jim Kowalski, a 20-year veteran who'd never seen a homicide until Sarah arrived. "Same MO as the Morrison and Chen cases." Sarah nodded grimly. 3 elderly residents, all found in peaceful poses that contradicted their violent deaths. All lived alone on the outskirts of town. All had been what locals called difficult, the type who complained about noise, reported code violations, and generally rubbed their neighbors the wrong way. What disturbed Sarah most wasn't the murders themselves, but the town's reaction. At Morrison's funeral, she'd overheard whispered conversations. Maybe now the Henderson property will finally get sold. That noise complaint about the music festival dies with her, I suppose. There was an undercurrent of relief that made her stomach turn. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered all 3 victims had received the same letter 2 weeks before their deaths. The Millbrook Preservation Society, an organization that didn't officially exist, had written to inform them that their properties had been selected for community improvement initiatives and that a representative would be calling soon. Sarah had never heard of this preservation society, despite being briefed on every local organization when she took the job. When she asked around, responses were evasive. "Oh, they're just some folks who care about keeping the town nice," Mayor Patricia Walsh had said, avoiding eye contact. The investigation led Sarah to the basement of the old Carnegie Library, where she found meeting minutes dating back 30 years. The Millbrook Preservation Society wasn't about preserving buildings, it was about preserving a way of life. The minutes detailed discussions about problem residents and community solutions. The language was coded but clear enough. They were deciding who belonged in their vision of Millbrook and who didn't. The most recent minutes, dated just 2 weeks ago, sent chills down Sarah's spine. Her own name appeared on a list titled Integration Concerns. Next to it, "Detective demonstrates excessive interest in community matters. Investigate background. Consider intervention protocols." Sarah's hands shook as she photographed the documents. The member list read like a who's who of Millbrook's establishment. The mayor, the bank president, the high school principal, the pastor of the largest church, even the fire chief. People who'd welcomed her to town with casseroles and friendly smiles. That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment above the hardware store, doors locked and blinds drawn. She tried calling the state police, but her cell phone had no signal. Unusual, since she'd never had problems before. The landline was dead too. A soft knock at her door made her freeze. Through the peephole, she saw Mayor Walsh, accompanied by Fire Chief Davidson and Dr. Reginald Morse, the town's beloved family physician. They stood quietly, patiently, like mourners at a viewing. "Detective Chen." Mayor Walsh's voice was gentle, concerned. "We know you've been working so hard on these terrible cases. The whole town appreciates your dedication. We'd like to talk to you about your findings." Sarah backed away from the door, her service weapon in her hand. "I'm not available right now, Mayor Walsh. We can meet at the station tomorrow." "I'm afraid that won't work, dear. You see, we've discovered some troubling things about your background check. Falsified documents, previous disciplinary actions that were covered up. The state police are very interested in speaking with you." Sarah knew it was a lie. Her record was spotless, but the calm certainty in Walsh's voice was terrifying. This was how it had started for the others. The gentle approach, the reasonable explanations, the community concern. "Dr. Morse has something to help you sleep," Walsh continued. "You've been under such stress. When you wake up, everything will be sorted out. The community will remember you fondly. A tragic case of a detective who cracked under pressure, unfortunately. But your sacrifice will help preserve what makes Millbrook special." The door handle turned slowly. Sarah realized they had a key. Of course they did. One of them probably owned the building. She climbed out the back window onto the fire escape, her heart hammering. Behind her, she heard them entering the apartment, their voices still calm and measured. They weren't hurrying. They knew she had nowhere to go in a town where everyone was either a member or too afraid to help. Sarah ran through the dark streets, past houses where she'd been welcomed, past businesses where owners had smiled and waved. Every shadow could hide a Preservation Society member. Every friendly face had been a mask. Her patrol car was parked at the station, but as she approached, she saw figures waiting by the building. They'd anticipated this too. These people had been perfecting their system for 30 years. The old mill at the edge of town was abandoned, its parking lot cracked and overgrown. Sarah hid behind the loading dock, trying to think. She could hear cars driving slowly through the streets, searching. Their voices carried on the night air, organized, methodical, a small-town search party with sinister intent. Her radio crackled to life. Deputy Kowalski's voice. "Detective Chen, please respond. We're concerned about your welfare. The state police have some questions about irregularities in the recent investigations. Please come in so we can sort this out." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. She'd come to Millbrook to escape urban crime, only to discover something worse. A criminal conspiracy so embedded in the community's fabric that it had become the community. The Preservation Society hadn't just infiltrated the town, it was the town. As dawn approached, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't run. They controlled. All the roads out. She couldn't hide. They knew every inch of Millbrook. But she could ensure the truth survived, even if she didn't. Using her phone's last bit of battery, she uploaded everything to a cloud storage account her sister in Portland could access. The meeting minutes, the member list, her own investigation, notes. She sent a final message. "If something happens to me, look into the Millbrook Preservation Society. They're not preserving buildings. They're preserving murder." The phone died as footsteps approached the mill. Sarah stood up, hands visible, her service weapon holstered. Mayor Walsh emerged from the shadows with Dr. Morse and Fire Chief Davidson. Their faces showed no anger, no satisfaction, just the calm efficiency of people performing a necessary community service. "You really could have been happy here," Walsh said sadly. "Millbrook is a wonderful place for people who understand how to fit in. But some folks are just too curious for their own good." Dr. Morse opened his medical bag, retrieving a syringe. "This won't hurt, Detective. You'll just go to sleep, and when they find you, it'll look like the stress finally got to you. Suicide, unfortunately. The case files will show you were becoming unstable, seeing conspiracies where none existed. As they approached, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the growing daylight, she could see other figures emerging from various hiding spots around the mill. Not just the society's leadership, but dozens of ordinary-looking townspeople. The librarian who'd helped her research property records, the diner owner who'd served her coffee every morning, the postal worker who always asked about her day, all of them watching with the same calm, patient expressions. The Preservation Society wasn't a small cabal of powerful individuals. It was the entire town, working together to maintain their vision of community perfection. And Detective Sarah Chen, like the 3 elderly victims before her, had been voted out of their perfect world. The last thing she saw before Dr. Morse's injection took effect was the sun rising over Millbrook's picturesque Main Street, illuminating a town where everyone knew their place, everyone followed the rules, and anyone who didn't simply disappeared. 3 days later, the Portland police found Sarah's body in a ravine outside town. The official report cited suicide brought on by job stress and isolation. Case closed. The Millbrook Preservation Society's next meeting was held that same evening, as always, in the library basement. They had a new item on their agenda, discussing the applications from several families interested in moving to their charming small town. After all, they had some vacant properties that needed good community-minded residents. The meeting minutes from that night would later record a unanimous vote. Millbrook would continue to be preserved, exactly as it was meant to be. Story 2, the Clearwater Collection. Rebecca Martinez had driven through dozens of small towns during her cross-country move from Boston to Seattle, but Clearwater made her stop. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light hit the Victorian houses lining Maple Street, or how the town square actually had people sitting on benches feeding pigeons like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. Whatever it was, when she saw the room for rent sign in the window of Mrs. Abernathy's bed and breakfast, she decided to stay the night. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, Rebecca couldn't bring herself to leave. It wasn't just the town's charm, though Clearwater seemed almost too perfect. The residents were unfailingly polite, the crime rate was non-existent, and the autumn colors were spectacular. But there was something else, something that had been nagging at her since her first morning in town, when she'd gone for a walk and noticed the photographs. They were everywhere once you started looking, in shop windows, on telephone poles, tacked to the community bulletin board at the post office, missing person flyers, dozens of them, dating back years. But unlike the usual desperate pleas with reward offers and family contact information, these were different. They were formatted like movie posters or art gallery announcements. The Clearwater Collection proudly presents Jennifer Walsh, 19. Last seen October 15, 2019. Auburn hair, green eyes, approximately 5 and 6. A lovely addition to our community showcase. Rebecca had asked Mrs. Abernathy about the unusual flyers that first morning. The elderly woman had smiled warmly while setting down a plate of homemade blueberry pancakes. Oh, those. Well, you know how small towns are, dear. We like to remember our visitors. So many young people pass through Clearwater, hikers, travelers like yourself. When they move on, we keep their pictures up as a sort of tribute. But Rebecca was a photographer by trade, and she had a good eye for details. The photos on the flyers weren't casual snapshots or driver's license pictures. They were professional quality portraits, carefully lit and composed. Studio photographs, taken with expensive equipment. The subjects all shared certain characteristics. Young adults, typically in their 20s or early 30s, attractive, with an almost ethereal quality to their expressions. They looked peaceful, serene even. But there was something in their eyes. A distant, empty quality that Rebecca recognized from her work photographing models who'd been over-medicated or exhausted. She started documenting the flyers with her camera, noting locations and dates. The pattern became clear. New editions appeared monthly, sometimes more frequently. The dates went back over a decade. If these were truly missing persons, Clearwater had the highest disappearance rate per capita of anywhere in the country. Rebecca's breakthrough came when she recognized one of the faces. Tommy Chen, according to his flyer, had been presented to the collection in August 2022. But Rebecca had gone to college with a Tommy Chen who matched the description perfectly. She'd even had a brief relationship with him junior year. Her online search confirmed her suspicions. Thomas Chen, 24, had been reported missing by his family while traveling cross-country after graduation. His car had been found abandoned at a rest stop in Idaho, 50 miles from Clearwater. The police report cited no signs of foul play, assuming he'd either had an accident in the wilderness or chosen to disappear voluntarily. But Tommy was in Clearwater. Or at least, his photograph was. Rebecca began investigating in earnest, using her professional photographer credentials to ask questions around town. She told people she was working on a project about small-town America, documenting local traditions. The residents were happy to talk, proud of their community's uniqueness. "The collection is our most treasured tradition," explained Harold Winters, the town librarian. "Started by old Heinrich Zimmermann back in the 70s. He was quite the artist, you know. Had a real eye for capturing the essence of a person." "What happened to Mr. Zimmermann?" Rebecca asked. "Oh, he passed years ago, but his work continues. The collection has become a community effort now. Everyone contributes." At the Historical Society, Rebecca learned more about Heinrich Zimmermann. He'd moved to Clearwater in 1974, purchasing an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. Local newspaper clippings described him as a reclusive artist who'd made a fortune in Europe before emigrating to America. He'd been generous with local charities and was remembered fondly, despite his eccentric habits. The mansion, Rebecca discovered, was now owned by the town itself, maintained as a private museum. Tours were available by appointment only. Rebecca made an appointment for the following day. The Zimmermann house sat on 5 acres of perfectly manicured grounds, surrounded by a wrought iron fence. Mrs. Dorothy Henley, the town's unofficial historian, met Rebecca at the front gate with an old-fashioned skeleton key. Heinrich was quite the collector, Mrs. Henley explained as they walked up the cobblestone path. Not just art, but experiences. He believed beauty was something to be preserved, protected from the ravages of time. The house's interior was a monument to Victorian excess. Heavy velvet drapes, ornate furniture, and walls covered in gilt-framed paintings. But it was the photographs that caught Rebecca's attention. Professional portraits lined the hallways, dozens of them, all featuring young people with that same serene, distant expression she'd noticed on the flyers. "These are beautiful," Rebecca said, studying the images more closely. The technical quality was exceptional, but there was something unsettling about the subjects' poses and expressions. They looked more like medical photographs than artistic portraits. Heinrich's specialty, Mrs. Henley said proudly. He had a gift for capturing people at their most peaceful moment. He called it eternal serenity. Rebecca felt a chill. She'd seen that exact phrase before, in the corner of several missing person flyers. They continued the tour, moving through rooms filled with antique furniture and curiosities. In what had been Zimmermann's study, Rebecca noticed a large, leather-bound ledger on the desk, open to a page covered in meticulous handwriting. "His collection notes," Mrs. Henley explained. Heinrich documented every piece in his collection. Names, dates, acquisition details. He was very thorough. Rebecca leaned closer, reading the entries. Each one described a subject: physical characteristics, personality traits, circumstances of acquisition. The language was clinical, detached, like a scientist cataloging specimens. "Mrs. Henley," Rebecca said carefully, "these entries, they read like he was collecting people, not just photographing them." The older woman's smile never wavered. "In a way he was." Heinrich believed that true beauty was fleeting, that people were at their most perfect in certain moments. He dedicated his life to capturing and preserving those moments. But what happened to the people after they were photographed? They became part of the collection, of course, immortalized at their most beautiful. Rebecca felt her stomach drop. The casual way Mrs. Henley spoke, the pride in her voice, it was as if they were discussing flower arrangements, not human lives. Like to see more of his work, Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice steady. Are there other rooms? Oh yes, the studio is downstairs. That's where the real work was done, but I'm afraid it's not part of the regular tour. Too fragile, you understand. The equipment is quite old. Rebecca nodded, but her mind was racing. She needed to see that studio. That evening, Rebecca sat in her room at Mrs. Abernathy's bed and breakfast, studying the photos she'd taken of the ledger entries. The handwriting became easier to read with practice, and what she discovered made her blood run cold. The entries weren't just descriptions, they were detailed records of murders. Zimmerman had documented how he'd lured victims to his house, how he'd drugged them, how he'd posed and photographed them as they died. The eternal serenity in their expressions wasn't peace, it was death, captured in the moment of transition. But the ledger entries continued past Zimmerman's death in 1998. The handwriting changed, became multiple hands contributing to the same dark record. The Clearwater collection hadn't ended with its founder. It had been inherited by the entire town. Rebecca realized she was in immediate danger. She was exactly the type Heinrich Zimmerman had preferred. Young, attractive, traveling. Alone with no set schedule. The perfect addition to the collection. The Preservation Society wasn't a small cabal of powerful individuals. It was the entire town, working together to maintain their vision of community perfection. And Detective Sarah Chen, like the three elderly victims before her, had been voted out of their perfect world. The last thing she saw before Dr. Morse's injection took effect was the sun rising over Millbrook's picturesque Main Street, illuminating a town where everyone knew their place, everyone followed the rules, and anyone who didn't simply disappeared. 3 days later, the Portland police found Sarah's body in a ravine outside town. The official report cited suicide brought on by job stress and isolation. Case closed. The Millbrook Preservation Society's next meeting was held that same evening, as always, in the library basement. They had a new item on their agenda, discussing the applications from several families interested in moving to their charming small town. After all, they had some vacant properties that needed good community-minded residents. Story 3. The Congregation. Pastor Daniel Marsh had been driving for 6 hours when his GPS led him down the winding mountain road toward Shepherd's Rest, Wyoming. The small town wasn't on most maps, population 312 according to the faded welcome sign, but it had what he desperately needed, a congregation in search of a new minister, and no questions asked about his past. The scandal in Denver had destroyed everything. Accusations of financial impropriety, though never proven, had made him radioactive to mainstream denominations. His wife had left, taking their daughter. His reputation was in ruins. But small, isolated communities were often desperate enough to overlook such concerns, especially when a candidate was willing to work for little more than room and board. The Achib Shepherd's Rest Community Church sat at the town's heart, a modest white building with a tall steeple that seemed to pierce the perpetually overcast sky. Daniel parked his battered sedan and approached the front steps, where a small group waited to greet him. Pastor Marsh, a thin man in his 60s, extended a weathered hand. I'm Ezra Whitmore, head of the search committee. Welcome to our little corner of God's country. The other committee members introduced themselves. Sarah Beth Collins, the church secretary, Thomas Brennan, the town's banker, and Margaret Stone, who ran the local general store. They were friendly enough, though Daniel noticed how they kept glancing at each other with meaningful looks he couldn't quite interpret. We're so grateful you've come, Sarah Beth said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. It's been difficult since Pastor Henley passed. The congregation has been waiting for guidance. They showed Daniel through the church, a simple sanctuary, with wooden pews and stained glass windows depicting familiar biblical scenes. Everything seemed normal until they reached the basement, which had been converted into what Ezra called fellowship space. The basement was larger than seemed possible given the church's footprint above, with stone walls that looked much older than the building itself. Along the walls hung portraits of previous pastors, dating back to the town's founding in 1891. Daniel noticed that none of the portraits showed pastors who looked older than middle age. Short tenure? Daniel asked, studying the dates beneath each portrait. You could say that, Ezra replied. Shepherd's Rest has specific spiritual needs. Not every minister is called to serve here long term. That evening, Daniel settled into the small parsonage next to the church. The house was sparsely furnished but comfortable, with a well-stocked library of theological texts. As he unpacked, he found a leather journal hidden behind some books, apparently left by his predecessor. Pastor Jonathan Henley's journal made for disturbing reading. The entries began normally enough. Observations about the congregation, notes for sermons, thoughts on small-town ministry. But as Daniel read further, the tone grew increasingly troubled. The congregation's spiritual hunger is unlike anything I've encountered, Henley had written. They seek not just comfort or guidance, but something more primal. During last Sunday's communion, I noticed several members weren't consuming the bread and wine. They were saving it, collecting it in small containers. When I asked Sarah Beth about this practice, she said it was for special occasions, but wouldn't elaborate. Later entries grew more disturbing. I've discovered that the church basement extends much further than I initially realized. There are rooms beneath the fellowship space that Ezra claims are storage areas, but they're accessed through what appears to be a hidden door behind the old furnace. When I asked to see these areas, the committee became evasive. They say some parts of the church are not for pastoral use. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before Henley's supposed death from a heart attack, was barely legible. They're not what they seem. The congregation, the town, something is deeply wrong here. I found the other rooms tonight. God help me. I found what they keep down there. I have to leave, but I don't think they'll let me. If someone finds this journal, don't trust anyone in Shepherd's Rest. The congregation serves something, but it isn't God. Daniel set the journal aside, telling himself it was the paranoid ramblings of a man under stress. Small towns often had odd traditions, insular communities that seemed strange to outsiders. He'd dealt with unusual congregations before. His first Sunday service seemed to confirm his rational assessment. About 40 people attended, mostly older residents with a few younger families. They sang hymns with genuine fervor, listened attentively to his sermon, and welcomed him warmly during the coffee hour afterward. But Daniel began noticing small details that bothered him. During communion, he observed what Henley had described, several members discreetly pocketing portions of the bread and wine. When he offered to visit shut-in members, he was told that home visits aren't part of our tradition here, and whenever he suggested changes to church practices or expressed interest in town history, conversations would politely but firmly redirect. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into his tenure when Daniel discovered the hidden door Henley had mentioned. While looking for Christmas decorations in the basement storage area, he noticed scratches on the floor near the old furnace. Investigation revealed that the entire unit could be rotated on hidden hinges, revealing a stone staircase leading deeper, underground. Daniel descended with a flashlight, his heart pounding. The passages below were ancient, carved from living rock, with symbols etched into the walls that predated any Christian iconography he recognized. The tunnels branched in multiple directions, extending far beneath the town. Following the main passage, Daniel emerged into a vast underground chamber lit by oil lamps. The space was clearly ceremonial, with a raised stone platform at the center, surrounded by concentric circles of carved symbols. But what made him gasp in horror were the alcoves lining the chamber walls. Each alcove contained a human form, but not quite human anymore. The bodies were preserved through some unknown process, their skin taking on a waxy, translucent quality. They wore the remnants of clothes from different eras, suits from the 1950s, dresses from the 1970s, more recent attire. Some still had name tags or personal effects that identified them as former pastors, teachers, doctors, outsiders who had come to serve Shepherd's Rest. At the chamber's far end, Daniel found Pastor Henley. His body showed the same unnatural preservation as the others, but his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Pinned to his jacket was a note in Sarah Beth's handwriting. Fed to the congregation, October 13th, sustained us through the winter months. Daniel stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The congregation wasn't preserving these bodies out of some twisted reverence. They were preserving them as food. The communion elements he'd seen them collect, the evasiveness about certain church traditions, the way previous pastors never seemed to serve long terms, it all made horrific sense. He ran for the exit, but footsteps echoed through the tunnels. Behind him, they'd known he would eventually find the chamber. They'd been waiting. Daniel made it to the main basement, but Ezra Whitmore stood blocking the stairs, flanked by other congregation members. In the lamplight, Daniel could see what he'd missed before, the subtle signs of malnutrition despite the town's apparent prosperity, the way their skin had a slightly gray pallor, the predatory gleam in their eyes. "Pastor Marsh," Ezra said calmly, "I see you've discovered our most sacred tradition. The congregation has sustained itself for over a century through God's provision of shepherds who come to serve our community. You're talking about cannibalism." Daniel gasped. "Murder." "We prefer to think of it as communion in its truest form," Sarah Beth added, descending the stairs behind several other members. "The shepherds give their lives so the flock may survive. It's biblical, really. Christ gave his body and blood for humanity. Our pastors simply follow his example." Daniel backed toward the hidden entrance, but Thomas Brennan emerged from that direction, cutting off his escape. "The winters here are harsh, Pastor. Food is scarce. Our ancestors learned to adapt. When missionaries began arriving in the 1890s, bringing word of communion and sacrifice, we understood that God was showing us the path to survival. Every few years, a new shepherd arrives," Margaret Stone explained, her grandmother's voice carrying the authority of someone who'd participated in this ritual for decades. "They serve the community briefly, providing spiritual guidance, and then they provide sustenance. It's a beautiful cycle, really. Their sacrifice ensures our survival, and their preservation in the sacred chamber means they remain part of our congregation forever." Daniel realized the full horror of his situation. The entire town was complicit. They lured outsiders, pastors, teachers, anyone with skills the community needed temporarily, and when those outsiders had served their purpose, they became literal sustenance for the town's survival. "How many?" Daniel whispered. 43 shepherds over the years," Ezra said proudly. "Each one remembered and honored. You'll be joining a blessed tradition, Pastor Marsh." Daniel noticed that the congregation members were positioning themselves strategically, but they weren't rushing him. They seemed to be following some kind of ritual protocol, possibly giving him time to understand and accept his fate. "The consumption doesn't happen immediately," Thomas explained as if reading his thoughts. "First comes the preparation ceremony. You'll be given a special communion that will ease the transition. Then you'll rest in the sacred chamber while the preservation process begins. It's quite peaceful, according to the journals we've recovered from previous shepherds." "Previous journals?" Daniel's blood ran cold. Sarah Beth nodded. "Oh yes, most of our shepherds were writers. Their final thoughts are quite moving, actually. They usually come to understand the honor of their position by the end." Daniel thought of Henley's terrified expression in the preservation chamber. Whatever understanding they claimed their victims achieved, it clearly didn't eliminate the horror of the experience. "The ceremony will take place tomorrow night," Ezra continued. "Sunday communion has always been our most sacred service. The entire congregation will participate, as is traditional. Tonight, you'll remain in the parsonage to prepare yourself spiritually." They began to withdraw, leaving Daniel alone in the basement. He understood that this wasn't mercy. They simply didn't see him as capable of escape. Where could he go in a town where everyone was complicit? The isolation that had made Shepherd's Rest attractive as a hiding place now made it a perfect trap. Daniel returned to the parsonage, his mind racing. He had less than 24 hours to find a way out. His car keys had been taken, he'd noticed, Thomas slipping them from his jacket pocket during the confrontation. The town's phone lines ran through a single exchange that the congregation undoubtedly controlled. But Daniel had something his predecessors might not have possessed: knowledge of the congregation's methods and timeline. They followed a ritual schedule, which meant they would be predictable, and his years in urban ministry had taught him something about survival that small-town pastors might have lacked. He spent the night going through Henley's journal more carefully, looking for details about the underground chamber and any possible escape routes. Henley had been thorough despite his terror, noting that the tunnel system extended beyond the town limits and connected to natural cave formations in the surrounding mountains. More importantly, Henley had observed that the congregation's preservation process wasn't immediate. The victims were drugged and taken to the chamber alive, where they remained conscious for some time before the final stages. If Daniel could resist or delay the drugging process, he might have an opportunity. The next evening, the entire town gathered in the church. Daniel was escorted from the parsonage by Ezra and Thomas, who treated him with the solemnity reserved for honored guests. The sanctuary was packed with every resident of Shepherd's Rest, from elderly founders to young children who'd grown up with this twisted tradition. "Before we begin," Daniel said as they approached the altar, "I'd like to deliver one final sermon to my congregation." Ezra looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, Pastor. It's traditional for the shepherd to offer final words." Daniel stepped behind the pulpit, looking out at the faces of people who'd welcomed him warmly while planning his murder. Children sat beside their parents, all waiting patiently for the ceremony that would end with his death and consumption. "My text tonight comes from Matthew 7:15, Daniel began. "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." He saw several congregation members shift uncomfortably, but they continued listening. For over a century, this congregation has perverted the sacred act of communion, turning Christ's message of love into an excuse for murder. You've convinced yourselves that God sanctions your cannibalism, but you're not following Christ. You're following something much older and much darker. Daniel could see Ezra signaling to other members, but he pressed on. "The symbols I found in your underground chamber aren't Christian. They're much older, predating Christ by millennia. You're not a Christian congregation. You're practitioners of an ancient cult that has used Christian imagery as camouflage." "Enough." Sarah Beth stood, her patience finally exhausted. "Bring him down for the preparation." But Daniel was ready. Instead of allowing himself to be led to the basement, he vaulted over the communion rail and ran for the church's front entrance. The congregation erupted in chaos, but they'd been expecting a compliant victim, not someone prepared to fight. Daniel burst through the front doors and sprinted toward the mountains. Behind him, he could hear the entire town mobilizing for pursuit. But he had a crucial advantage. He knew they needed him alive for their ritual. They would capture him, not kill him outright. The chase through the mountain forest was harrowing, but Daniel's desperate energy carried him further than his pursuers expected. He found one of the cave entrances Henley had mentioned and squeezed inside, following natural passages that connected to the church's tunnel system. But instead of hiding, Daniel did something the congregation wouldn't anticipate. He returned to their sacred chamber through the cave system, approaching from a direction they wouldn't expect. The preservation chamber was empty. The entire town was out searching for him. But Daniel wasn't there to hide. He was there to destroy their ability to continue their tradition. Using oil from the ceremonial lamps, Daniel set fire to the preserved bodies in their alcoves. The ancient preservation process had left the corpses highly flammable, and soon the entire chamber was ablaze. He also located and destroyed what appeared to be ritual implements and the ceremonial substances used in their preservation process. Most importantly, he found a cache of journals from previous victims and several ceremonial books that documented the cult's practices. These he kept, wrapping them in plastic sheeting he found in a storage area. As flames began to fill the chamber with smoke, Daniel escaped through the cave system, making his way to a different exit point miles from town. The fire would eventually spread through the wooden church above, but more critically, it would destroy the preserved bodies that had sustained the congregation for generations. By the time the congregation returned from their search, their sacred chamber was destroyed and Daniel was miles away, hiking toward the nearest highway with evidence of their crimes. The state police investigation that followed Daniel's report initially met with skepticism, but the physical evidence was overwhelming. The remains of 43 bodies were found in the burned chamber, along with ritual implements and documentation of over a century of systematic murder. The entire population of Shepherd's Rest was arrested, from the eldest church members to the youngest adults who participated in the murders. The children were placed in protective custody, though psychologists would struggle for years to undo the damage of growing up in a community where ritualized cannibalism was considered normal. Daniel never returned to ministry. The experience had shattered his faith, not in God, but in humanity's capacity for self-deception. He became a consultant for law enforcement agencies investigating cult activities, using his experience to help identify communities where religious beliefs had been twisted to justify atrocities. But sometimes, late at night, Daniel would wake from dreams of that underground chamber, remembering the 43 faces of the preserved victims. They had all come to Shepherd's Rest, seeking to serve God and community, just as he had. The only difference was that Daniel had found Pastor Henley's journal in time to learn the truth. In his own journal, which he kept locked away, Daniel wrote, "Evil rarely announces itself with horns and pitchforks. More often it comes dressed in familiar clothes, speaking familiar words, offering what seems like sanctuary." The congregation of Shepherd's Rest convinced themselves that murder was communion, that cannibalism was Christ-like sacrifice. They weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who had accepted the unacceptable, one small compromise at a time, until horror became holy ritual. The town of Shepherd's Rest was abandoned after the trials, its buildings left to decay in the mountain wilderness. But sometimes hikers report finding religious pamphlets scattered in the ruins, bearing the congregation's final message. The shepherd gives his life for the flock. Come unto us, all ye who are weary, and we will give you rest. The pamphlets are always removed by park services, but they continue to appear as if the town itself is still calling for new shepherds to come and serve its hungry congregation. Story 4. The Whitmore method. Dr. Amanda Sterling had specialized in treating trauma victims for 15 years, but the case that brought her to Millfield was unlike anything in her experience. 3 families had contacted the State Psychological Services Board about their children, all claiming their kids had been changed after participating in the town's renowned youth development program. Millfield was the kind of place child psychology textbooks held up as an ideal environment. Low crime, excellent schools, strong community involvement. The town's crown jewel was the Whitmore Youth Development Center, founded by Dr. Richard Whitmore in 1987. For over 3 decades, the center had maintained a perfect record. Every child who completed the program showed dramatic improvement in academic performance, social adjustment, and behavioral issues. The waiting list to enroll troubled children was years long. Families drove from across the country, desperate to help sons and daughters who'd been written off by conventional therapy. The center's success rate was literally unprecedented. 100% of participants showed complete behavioral transformation. Within 6 months, Amanda's first meeting was with the Hendricks family. Their daughter, Jessica, 14, had been sent to Millfield 8 months earlier to address severe behavioral problems, truancy, drug experimentation, and violent outbursts that had escalated to assault charges. She came back completely different. Mrs. Hendricks explained, her voice carrying an odd mixture of gratitude and unease. Perfect grades, polite, helpful around the house. She never argues, never talks back. It's everything we hoped for, but, Amanda prompted. Mr. Hendricks shifted uncomfortably. She doesn't seem like Jessica anymore. It's like living with a very polite stranger who happens to look like our daughter. She smiles at appropriate times, says the right things, but there's nothing behind her eyes. Amanda interviewed Jessica separately. The teenager was indeed perfectly behaved, articulate, respectful, and eerily composed. When asked about her experiences at the Whitmore Center, Jessica's responses were uniformly positive. Dr. Whitmore helped me understand how destructive my previous behaviors were, Jessica said, her tone flat despite the positive words. The program taught me to make better choices and consider the needs of others before my own selfish desires. The phrases sounded rehearsed, like responses she'd been trained to give. When Amanda probed deeper, asking about specific memories or feelings from before the program, Jessica's composure faltered slightly. I don't really remember much about that time, she said. Dr. Whitmore explained that traumatic memories can interfere with personal growth. It's better not to dwell on past mistakes. Amanda's interviews with the other families revealed identical patterns. Children who'd entered the program with various behavioral issues, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, substance abuse, all returned as perfect, compliant teenagers with limited memories of their previous lives and personalities. The parents had gotten exactly what they'd asked for: well-behaved children who caused no problems. But the cost seemed to be their children's authentic personalities, their individual quirks and characteristics that had made them unique human beings rather than behavioral problems to be solved. Amanda's request to observe the Whitmore Center was initially denied, but her credentials and state authorization eventually secured her access. Dr. Richard Whitmore was a distinguished man in his 70s, with the kind of paternal authority that inspired immediate trust. "Dr. Sterling, welcome to our little corner of transformation," he said, leading her through the center's main building. "I understand you've been speaking with some of our program families. Adjustment issues, I assume?" "The families are concerned about personality changes in their children," Amanda said carefully. "They feel their kids have lost something essential about themselves." Dr. Whitmore nodded sympathetically. "A common concern, and understandable. When we eliminate destructive behavioral patterns, parents sometimes mistake those patterns for personality traits. What they're mourning is often their child's capacity for self-destructive behavior." The center itself was impressive. Modern facilities, state-of-the-art equipment, and a staff of credentialed professionals. Amanda observed group therapy sessions, individual counseling appointments, and educational activities. Everything appeared above board, even exemplary. But Amanda noticed subtle details that troubled her. The children in the program moved and spoke with an odd uniformity. Their interactions seemed scripted, lacking the natural chaos and spontaneity of normal teenage behavior. When she tried to engage them in conversation, their responses were polite but generic, as if they were following invisible prompts. During a tour of the residential facilities, Amanda requested to see the medical records for current participants. Dr. Whitmore's refusal was polite but firm. "Patient confidentiality is paramount in our work, Dr. Sterling. I'm sure you understand. However, I can assure you that all our methods are thoroughly documented and medically sound." That evening, Amanda reviewed the limited information she'd gathered. The Whitmore method, as it was called in professional journals, was remarkably well documented in terms of outcomes, but frustratingly vague about specific techniques. Published studies focused on statistical results rather than therapeutic processes. Amanda's breakthrough came when she discovered that one of the center's former staff members, Dr. Elena Vasquez, had left abruptly 2 years earlier and now worked at a clinic in Denver. A phone call revealed that Dr. Vasquez was willing to discuss her concerns about the Whitmore Center, but only in person. They met at a coffee shop far from any potential surveillance. Dr. Vasquez was clearly nervous, checking over her shoulder frequently as she spoke. "I worked at the center for 3 years, she began. The results were undeniable. Every child who completed the program showed dramatic behavioral improvement. But the methods," she shuddered. "Dr. Whitmore calls it therapeutic personality reconstruction, but it's closer to psychological lobotomy." "Can you be more specific?" Amanda asked. "The children undergo intensive therapy sessions that use a combination of pharmaceutical intervention, hypnosis, and what can only be described as systematic psychological conditioning. The goal isn't to help them cope with behavioral issues, it's to eliminate the parts of their personality that generate those issues." Dr. Vasquez explained that the process involved identifying what Dr. Whitmore called problematic personality clusters. Traits like independence, creativity, emotional volatility, or strong opinions that might contribute to behavioral problems. These traits were then systematically suppressed through a combination of drugs, hypnotic suggestion, and behavioral modification. The children emerge as functional, compliant individuals, Dr. Vasquez continued. But they're not the same people who entered the program. Their capacity for independent thought, emotional expression, and personal autonomy has been stripped away. "Why didn't you report this to authorities?" Amanda asked. I tried. But Dr. Whitmore's reputation is unassailable. The parents are thrilled with the results, and the children themselves report being happy and satisfied. Technically, no laws are being broken. The parents consented to treatment, the children aren't being physically harmed, and the outcomes are positive by conventional measures. Dr. Vasquez had left when she realized the full implications of what they were doing. We weren't treating troubled children. We were creating a generation of compliant automatons. The children who graduate from the program will never cause problems again, but they'll also never create anything meaningful, never challenge authority, never experience genuine passion or individuality. Armed with this information, Amanda returned to Millfield with a plan. She couldn't legally force her way into the center's confidential records, but she could request permission to conduct follow-up interviews with program graduates under the guise of a longitudinal study on treatment effectiveness. Dr. Whitmore agreed, confident that his success stories would only reinforce his program's reputation. But Amanda's interviews revealed the true horror of the Whitmore method. She spoke with dozens of former participants, now young adults, and found the same pattern in each case. They were functional members of society, employed, law-abiding, causing no problems for anyone. But they lived their lives like carefully programmed machines, following predetermined patterns without creativity, passion, or genuine autonomy. Marcus Chen, now 22, had graduated from the program 5 years earlier, after treatment for ADHD and behavioral issues. He worked as an accountant, lived alone in a neat apartment, and maintained a rigid daily routine. "I'm very satisfied with my life," he told Amanda, his tone pleasant but emotionless. "The program taught me the importance of structure and compliance. I follow my schedule, complete my work efficiently, and avoid behaviors that might cause problems for others." When Amanda asked about his dreams, aspirations, or personal interests, Marcus looked genuinely confused. "I don't understand the question. I have my work and my routine. What more would I need?" The interview that broke Amanda's heart was with Sarah Milligan, a 19-year-old who'd completed the program 3 years earlier. Before treatment, Sarah had been a rebellious, creative teenager with dreams of becoming an artist. Her parents had sent her to Millfield after she'd been caught spray painting murals on abandoned buildings. "Art was a form of destructive self-expression," Sarah explained, her voice carrying no trace of sadness or loss. "The program helped me understand that individual creative urges often conflict with social harmony. I'm much happier now, focusing on productive activities that benefit everyone." Sarah worked part-time at a grocery store and spent her free time volunteering for approved community organizations. When Amanda asked if she ever felt the urge to create art, Sarah's face showed a moment of confusion, as if trying to access memories that were no longer there. "I don't remember feeling those urges," she said finally. Dr. Whitmore explained that unhealthy memories can interfere with personal growth. It's better not to dwell on past mistakes. Amanda realized she was looking at victims of a sophisticated form of psychological abuse. The Whitmore method didn't heal troubled children. It erased the parts of their personalities that made them individuals, leaving behind compliant shells, programmed to function according to social expectations. But proving this to authorities would be nearly impossible. The victims reported being happy and successful. Their parents were grateful for the transformation. Dr. Whitmore's methods, while ethically questionable, weren't clearly illegal. And the man himself was protected by decades of professional reputation and powerful connections in the child psychology community. Amanda's investigation took a darker turn when she discovered that several program graduates had died by suicide in the years following their treatment. The deaths were scattered across different states and time periods, making it difficult to identify a pattern. But Amanda found common elements in each case. The suicide notes were remarkably similar, expressing gratitude for their treatment, but describing a persistent sense of emptiness and disconnection from their own lives. They wrote about feeling like actors playing roles rather than authentic human beings, and about the growing realization that something essential had been taken from them. One note from a 21-year-old named David Park was particularly haunting. "I know I should be happy. The program fixed all my problems and made me into everything my parents wanted. But I don't feel like a real person anymore. I remember being David before, but I can't remember what that felt like. Living as this empty version of myself is worse than the problems I used to have. Amanda compiled her evidence, the interviews, the suicide pattern, Dr. Vasquez's testimony, and prepared to file a formal complaint with the state board. But the night before her submission deadline, she received a call from Dr. Whitmore. "Dr. Sterling, I understand you've been conducting unauthorized research on our program graduates. I'm concerned that your methodology may be causing psychological distress to these young people by encouraging them to question their successful treatment outcomes." His tone was pleasant, but the underlying threat was clear. "I've spoken with several of the families you've contacted, and they're quite upset that someone is trying to convince their children that their positive life changes are somehow problematic. Some are considering legal action for intentional infliction of emotional distress." Amanda realized that Dr. Whitmore had anticipated her investigation and was moving to neutralize it. The program graduates themselves, conditioned to avoid conflict, and please authority figures, would never support accusations against their treatment. The parents, thrilled with their compliant children, saw Amanda as someone trying to undo their family's success story. "Dr. Sterling," Dr. Whitmore continued, "I have a proposal. Rather than pursue what can only be a futile and professionally damaging course of action, why not experience our methods firsthand? I believe you have some anger management issues that stem from childhood trauma. Our adult adaptation of the program could be very beneficial for someone in your position." The line went dead, leaving Amanda with the chilling realization that Dr. Whitmore knew far more about her personal history than any professional contact should. Her own therapy records, her childhood struggles with her father's abuse, her reputation for being difficult in professional settings. Somehow, he'd accessed information that should have been confidential. Amanda understood that she was in serious danger. Dr. Whitmore had perfected a system that erased inconvenient personalities while maintaining the appearance of legitimate therapy. He had powerful connections, grateful parents, and victims who would never testify against him because they'd been programmed to believe their treatment was beneficial. But Amanda also realized something Dr. Whitmore hadn't anticipated. She'd documented everything, and she'd shared her concerns with colleagues outside of his influence network. If something happened to her, if she suddenly developed personality issues that required treatment, her research would survive. Amanda fled Millfield that night, driving straight to the state capitol where she hand-delivered her complaint to the Attorney General's office. The investigation that followed was lengthy and complex, hampered by the lack of cooperative victims and the sophisticated way Dr. Whitmore had constructed his operation. But eventually, the pattern of suicides among program graduates provided the leverage needed to obtain search warrants. Hidden cameras in therapy rooms revealed the true nature of the Whitmore method. Systematic psychological conditioning designed to eliminate individual personality traits in favor of compliant conformity. Dr. Whitmore was eventually prosecuted, though not for the crimes Amanda believed he'd committed. The charges were relatively minor: practicing medicine without proper oversight, falsifying research data, and insurance fraud. The legal system couldn't adequately address the psychological destruction he'd caused because his victims didn't recognize themselves as victims. The Whitmore Youth Development Center was closed, but hundreds of its graduates continued living their programmed lives, never understanding what had been taken from them. Some, like David Park, eventually realized the extent of their loss and chose death over continued existence as artificial personalities. Others lived out their lives as functional but empty human beings, serving as testament to the horrifying effectiveness of Dr. Whitmore's methods. Amanda returned to her practice, but she never forgot the lesson of Millfield, that the most insidious evil often disguises itself as healing, that the greatest cruelties can be inflicted by those who claim to help, and that society's desire for compliant, problem-free individuals can blind it to the value of authentic human personality, even when that personality includes traits that make life messy, complicated, and difficult. In her final report on the case, Amanda wrote, "The Whitmore method represents the logical extreme of treating human individuality as a problem to be solved rather than a characteristic to be nurtured. Dr. Whitmore didn't see troubled children. He saw defective products that needed to be reprogrammed according to social specifications." His success came from convincing parents that their children's personalities were the enemy, and that love meant erasing everything that made their kids unique individuals. The report was filed away in government archives, but Amanda made sure copies reached every major child psychology organization in the country. Somewhere, she knew, another Dr. Whitmore was probably perfecting his own method of erasing inconvenient human traits while convincing society that he was performing miracles of behavioral transformation. The children deserved someone to remember who they used to be before their personalities were deemed problematic and systematically erased in the name of healing. Story 5. The Hartwell Investigation. Detective Lisa Park had worked homicide in Detroit for 12 years before the stress broke her marriage and nearly broke her mind. The transfer to Hartwell seemed like salvation, a small college town in rural Michigan where the biggest crimes were usually drunk driving and property theft. The position paid less, but it promised the kind of quiet life she desperately needed to rebuild herself. That was before the Patterson case. Emma Patterson, 19, had been a sophomore at Hartwell College when she disappeared on a Thursday night in October. Her roommate reported her missing when she failed to return from what should have been a quick trip to the campus library. Emma's car was found in the library parking lot, keys still in the ignition, her backpack untouched in the passenger seat. The case should have been straightforward, a young woman who'd encountered the wrong person at the wrong time. But as Lisa dug deeper, she discovered that Emma Patterson was the 7th college student to vanish from Hartwell in the past 4 years. The previous disappearances had been handled by Lisa's predecessor, Detective Carl Morrison, who'd classified them as voluntary departures. College students, Morrison had reasoned, often dropped out suddenly due to academic pressure, family problems, or simply the desire to start fresh somewhere else. The fact that none of the missing students had contacted their families was explained as typical behavior for young adults asserting their independence. But Lisa's review of the case files revealed a troubling pattern Morrison had either missed or ignored. All 7 students shared specific characteristics. They were academically gifted loners with strained family relationships and few close friends. They were the type of students who could disappear without generating immediate alarm, whose absence might not be noticed for days or weeks. More disturbing was the geographic pattern. All 7 had last been seen in the same general area of campus, the older section near the original college buildings, where foot traffic was lighter and security cameras were sparse. The disappearances occurred during off-peak hours when few witnesses would be present. Lisa's investigation led her to Professor David Hartwell, great-grandson of the college's founder and the town's most prominent citizen. At 45, Professor Hartwell taught behavioral psychology and was beloved by students and faculty alike. His research on social isolation and cognitive conditioning had earned him national recognition, and his family's philanthropic contributions supported half the town's civic organizations. Emma Patterson had been enrolled in Professor Hartwell's advanced behavioral psychology course. So had 3 of the other missing students. When Lisa requested to interview Professor Hartwell, she was surprised by his eager cooperation. He met her in his office, a cluttered space filled with psychology texts and framed photos of him with various academic and political figures. "Detective Park, I'm so glad you're taking Emma's disappearance seriously," he said, gesturing for her to sit in a comfortable chair across from his desk. Carl Morrison was less thorough in his approach to these cases. Professor Hartwell spoke with obvious concern about his missing students, providing detailed character assessments and theories about their possible motivations for leaving. He seemed genuinely distressed by their disappearances and eager to help with the investigation. Emma was particularly vulnerable, he explained. Brilliant, but isolated. She'd mentioned feeling disconnected from her family and struggling to find her place here at Hartwell. Students like Emma often romanticize the idea of starting over somewhere else. Lisa found herself initially impressed by Professor Hartwell's insights and apparent dedication to his students' welfare. But as she left his office, something nagged at her, a sense that his responses had been too polished, too perfectly crafted. That evening, Lisa researched Professor Hartwell's academic background more thoroughly. His published research focused on what he called social integration therapy, techniques for helping isolated individuals develop better social connections and community involvement. The work seemed legitimate and even admirable, but buried. In the academic jargon, Lisa found references to more controversial concepts. Professor Hartwell had written extensively about therapeutic community integration and guided social conditioning for individuals who demonstrated maladaptive isolation patterns. The language was dense and clinical, but it seemed to describe methods for forcibly integrating antisocial individuals into community structures. Lisa's breakthrough came when she discovered that Professor Hartwell owned property beyond his faculty, housing, a large estate on the outskirts of town that had belonged to his family for generations. The property included several buildings, including what county records described as a private research facility that had been grandfathered in under various zoning exemptions. Obtaining a search warrant proved difficult. Professor Hartwell's reputation was impeccable. His family had deep connections throughout the county, and Lisa's evidence was largely circumstantial. The judge who finally approved the warrant did so reluctantly, and with strict limitations on scope and duration. The Hartwell estate sat on 200 acres of wooded land, accessible only by a private road that wound through dense forest. The main house was a Victorian mansion that had clearly been maintained with loving care, but Lisa's attention was drawn to a modern building set back among the trees, Professor Hartwell's research facility. The building's exterior was unremarkable, but the interior made Lisa's blood run cold. What she found was a sophisticated laboratory and residential facility designed for long-term human subjects. Multiple rooms contained hospital-style beds with restraint systems, monitoring equipment, and what appeared to be drug delivery mechanisms. But it was the observation room that revealed the true horror of Professor Hartwell's research. Banks of monitors showed feeds from cameras throughout the facility, including rooms Lisa hadn't yet discovered. On the screens, she could see people, young people who matched the descriptions of the missing students. They were alive, but barely recognizable as the individuals they'd once been. Their movements were slow and mechanical, their expressions vacant. They wore matching gray clothing and moved through daily routines with the programmed precision of robots. Lisa found the entrance to the residential section and made her way through corridors lined with individual rooms. Each room contained a young person whose identity matched one of the missing students. They were clean, fed, and apparently healthy, but showed no recognition when Lisa tried to communicate with them. Emma Patterson sat in her room, staring at the wall with empty eyes. When Lisa called her name, Emma turned slowly, her face showing no sign of recognition or distress. She'd been missing for 2 weeks, but seemed to have aged years in that time. "Emma, I'm Detective Park. I'm here to help you. Do you remember who you are?" Emma's response was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone. "I am Subject 7. I participate in community integration therapy. Professor Hartwell is helping me overcome my maladaptive social isolation." Lisa's heart sank as she realized what Professor Hartwell had done. He hadn't killed these students. He'd erased their personalities through some combination of drugs, psychological conditioning, and social programming. They'd been turned into living experiments in his theories of forced community integration. The sound of approaching vehicles sent Lisa running for the exit. Professor Hartwell had returned, probably alerted by the security system she'd triggered entering the facility. She managed to reach her patrol car just as several vehicles pulled into the estate's circular driveway. Professor Hartwell emerged from the lead car, accompanied by several men Lisa didn't recognize. His demeanor was calm, almost relieved, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation. "Detective Park," he called out, approaching her patrol car with his hands visible. "I'm glad you found them. I was wondering when someone would finally understand the scope of my work." Lisa kept her service weapon trained on him as she radioed for backup, though she doubted how quickly help would arrive at the remote location. "Professor Hartwell, you're under arrest for kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. The students in that facility need immediate medical attention." "Students?" Professor Hartwell looked genuinely confused. "Detective, those aren't students anymore." "They're success stories. Each one came to me as a socially isolated individual, unable to form meaningful connections with their community. Through my therapeutic intervention, they've been transformed into perfectly integrated community members. Lisa realized she was dealing with someone who genuinely believed his actions were therapeutic rather than criminal. Professor Hartwell had convinced himself that forcibly erasing his victims' personalities was a form of treatment rather than torture. They were volunteers in a sense, he continued, moving closer to her patrol car. Each one demonstrated through their behavior that they were unable to function in normal social structures. Rather than allowing them to continue suffering in isolation, I provided them with the opportunity to become productive members of a controlled community environment. You kidnapped them and destroyed their minds, Lisa said, trying to maintain her composure while waiting for backup. I integrated them, Professor Hartwell corrected. They now experience perfect social harmony within their community. No anxiety, no loneliness, no struggle to fit in. They've achieved the social connection they were previously incapable of, developing naturally. Lisa could hear sirens in the distance, but Professor Hartwell seemed unconcerned about the approaching authorities. The men with him, Lisa now realized they were probably other faculty members or local officials, showed no signs of fleeing or attempting to destroy evidence. Detective Park, I'd like you to meet some of my earlier success stories, Professor Hartwell said, gesturing to his companions. Dr. James Mitchell was a socially anxious chemistry professor who used to struggle with faculty meetings and student interactions. Now he's perfectly comfortable in any social situation. One of the men stepped forward and Lisa saw the same vacant expression she'd observed in the residential facility. Dr. Mitchell smiled pleasantly but said nothing, waiting for Professor Hartwell's permission to speak. Margaret Walsh was a troubled graduate student with severe depression and social phobia, Professor Hartwell continued, indicating a woman in her 30s. She attempted suicide twice before I intervened. Now she experiences constant contentment and social satisfaction. Lisa realized with growing horror that Professor Hartwell's operation was much larger than 7 missing college students. He'd been practicing his integration therapy on faculty, staff, and possibly community members for years, creating a network of psychologically controlled individuals who supported and protected his work. The backup units arrived just as Lisa was beginning to understand the full scope of what she'd discovered. But instead of the state police she'd requested, the responding officers were from the local sheriff's department, deputies who lived in Hartwell and would have known Professor Hartwell their entire lives. Detective Park, Sheriff Tom Bradley, called out as he approached her patrol car. Professor Hartwell called us, said there might be some kind of misunderstanding about his research facility. Lisa looked at Sheriff Bradley's face and saw the same empty pleasantness she'd observed in Professor Hartwell's other success stories. The sheriff's department, the local government, possibly half the town's leadership had been subjected to Professor Hartwell's integration therapy. Sheriff, I need you to call the state police immediately. Professor Hartwell has been kidnapping and psychologically torturing college students. The people in that facility need emergency medical intervention. Sheriff Bradley nodded sympathetically. I understand you're concerned, Detective, but Professor Hartwell has explained the situation to us. His research subjects are voluntary participants in a groundbreaking study of social integration therapy. Everything is completely legal and ethical. Lisa realized she was trapped. The local law enforcement had been compromised. The evidence was on private property, controlled by Professor Hartwell, and the victims themselves would likely testify that they were voluntary participants in beneficial therapy. Professor Hartwell approached her car window again, his expression kindly but firm. Detective Park, I can see that you're experiencing significant stress from this investigation. Social isolation and career pressure can create paranoid ideation and make it difficult to evaluate situations objectively. Lisa understood where this was heading. Professor Hartwell was going to claim she was mentally unstable, that her accusations were the product of psychological breakdown rather than legitimate investigation. The corrupted local authorities would support his assessment, and she would find herself committed for psychiatric evaluation. I think you would benefit greatly from a brief therapeutic intervention, Professor Hartwell continued. Just a few days of rest and social integration therapy. When you emerge, You'll be much better equipped to serve the Hartwell community effectively. Lisa made her decision quickly. Instead of waiting to be arrested or committed, she put her patrol car in reverse and fled the estate at high speed. Behind her, she could see Professor Hartwell and his associates making no effort to pursue. They were confident that she had nowhere to go in a town where the authorities were under their control. Lisa drove straight to the state police post in the next county, where she demanded to speak with detectives who had no connection to Hartwell. Her report was initially met with skepticism. Her claims seemed too outlandish to be credible, but her detailed evidence and obvious distress convinced them to launch their own investigation. The state police raid on the Hartwell estate 3 days later found the facility empty. Professor Hartwell claimed it was a legitimate research laboratory that had been temporarily shut down for equipment upgrades. The residential rooms Lisa had described were presented as guest quarters for visiting researchers. Most damaging to Lisa's credibility was the testimony of the missing students themselves. Emma Patterson and the others had been returned to campus, where they gave statements to investigators claiming they'd been participating in a voluntary research study. They described Professor Hartwell as a caring mentor who'd helped them overcome social anxiety and academic pressure. Detective Park seemed very stressed when she came to the facility. Emma told the state investigators, her voice carrying the same flat pleasantness Lisa remembered. She appeared to be experiencing some kind of breakdown. Professor Hartwell was concerned about her mental state. The other students provided similar accounts, all describing Lisa as unstable and paranoid. They showed no signs of distress or coercion, appearing to be normal college students who'd simply taken a temporary break from their studies to participate in psychological research. Professor Hartwell's reputation and the students' testimony created a compelling counter-narrative to Lisa's accusations. The investigation concluded that Detective Park had suffered a stress-induced psychological episode, possibly triggered by the pressure of her first major case since transferring from Detroit. Lisa found herself suspended pending psychiatric evaluation. The department psychologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, was thorough and professional, but she ultimately concluded that Lisa's allegations were the product of paranoid ideation brought on by career stress and social isolation. Detective Park, your concerns about Professor Hartwell and the missing students show a pattern of conspiracy thinking that's often associated with adjustment disorders, Dr. Chen explained during their final session. The evidence suggests you've constructed an elaborate delusion to explain your difficulties adapting to small-town law enforcement. Lisa was offered a choice: accept psychiatric treatment and possible reinstatement, or resign from the force. She chose to resign, knowing that accepting treatment would likely mean subjecting herself to the same kind of psychological conditioning she'd witnessed at the Hartwell facility. She left Hartwell that same day, driving straight to her sister's house in Chicago, but the experience haunted her. She'd seen 7 young people who'd been psychologically destroyed, yet no one would believe her because the victims themselves had been programmed to deny their victimization. Lisa spent months trying to interest other law enforcement agencies in the case, but Professor Hartwell's reputation was too strong and the evidence too circumstantial. The missing students had returned, appearing healthy and happy. There were no bodies, no clear crimes, no cooperative witnesses. The breakthrough came 8 months later when Lisa received a phone call from a young woman named Sarah Kim, a former Hartwell student who'd transferred to Northwestern after what she described as a disturbing experience with Professor Hartwell's research program. "I was never officially missing," Sarah explained when they met in Chicago. "But I participated in what Professor Hartwell called a intensive social integration workshop for students with adjustment issues. The experience was wrong, deeply wrong." Sarah had been struggling with depression and social anxiety during her sophomore year when Professor Hartwell recruited her for his research. She'd spent 3 weeks at his facility, undergoing what was described as experimental therapy for social disorders. "The first few days were normal therapy sessions," Sarah recalled. "But then they started giving me medications that made me feel disconnected from myself. The therapy became more intensive, more invasive. They were trying to reprogram how I thought about relationships and social interactions." Sarah had managed to resist the full conditioning process, possibly because she'd been naturally more skeptical than Professor Hartwell's usual targets. When she began questioning the treatment, she was quietly removed from the program and encouraged to transfer to another school. "I think I was supposed to become like the others, the ones who stayed in the program," Sarah said. "Empty, compliant, grateful. But something in me fought back. I kept enough of myself to recognize what was happening." Sarah's testimony provided Lisa with a crucial witness, but it also revealed the full scope of Professor Hartwell's operation. He wasn't just experimenting on kidnapped students. He was recruiting vulnerable individuals from the college community. People whose disappearance from the program could be explained as voluntary withdrawal or transfer. Working together, Lisa and Sarah began documenting the full extent of Professor Hartwell's influence in the Hartwell community. They identified dozens of individuals whose personalities had undergone dramatic changes after interaction with the professor's programs. Faculty members, students, even local business owners who'd participated in his community development initiatives. The pattern was consistent. Individuals who'd been struggling with social integration, depression, or behavioral issues would undergo Professor Hartwell's therapy and emerge as perfectly compliant, socially integrated community members. They reported being happy with their transformations and grateful for Professor Hartwell's help. But Lisa and Sarah also found evidence of resistance. Over the years, several individuals had attempted to expose Professor Hartwell's methods, only to be discredited as mentally unstable or motivated by personal grudges. Some had left town permanently, while others had suffered mysterious accidents or sudden onset of psychological problems that required intensive treatment. Their investigation revealed that Professor Hartwell's work had been funded by a combination of legitimate research grants and private donations from wealthy families, whose children had been successfully treated by his methods. The psychology department at Hartwell College had been complicit, either actively supporting his work or remaining willfully ignorant of his true methods. Lisa realized that bringing Professor Hartwell to justice would require federal intervention, since local and state authorities were either compromised or unwilling to act against such a prominent figure. She and Sarah compiled their evidence and approached the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which had experience with psychological manipulation and cult-like organizations. The federal investigation that followed was extensive and complex, involving surveillance, financial analysis, and interviews with dozens of individuals connected to Professor Hartwell's programs. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Professor Hartwell had been falsifying research data and misusing federal grant money to fund his unauthorized human experimentation. The charges weren't for the psychological crimes Lisa had witnessed. Those were too difficult to prove legally, since the victims refused to testify against their abuser. Instead, Professor Hartwell was prosecuted for fraud, unlawful human experimentation, and violations of federal research ethics guidelines. The trial was surreal. Professor Hartwell maintained his innocence, claiming that his work was legitimate, therapeutic research that had helped hundreds of individuals overcome social integration problems. His former subjects testified on his behalf, describing him as a caring mentor who'd transformed their lives for the better. But the federal prosecutors had something Professor Hartwell hadn't anticipated: detailed records of his actual methods, obtained through surveillance and forensic analysis of his research facility. The evidence showed systematic psychological manipulation, unauthorized drug experimentation, and deliberate personality modification techniques that violated every principle of ethical psychological research. Professor Hartwell was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His research facility was shut down, and Hartwell College's psychology department was placed under federal oversight. But the damage to his victims was largely irreversible. The individuals who'd undergone his integration therapy remained psychologically altered, their original personalities lost forever. Lisa never returned to law enforcement, but she did find a new purpose. Working with Sarah Kim and other survivors of Professor Hartwell's programs, she established a nonprofit organization dedicated to identifying and exposing psychological manipulation in academic and therapeutic settings. Their work revealed that Professor Hartwell's case wasn't unique across the country. Charismatic individuals in positions of authority were using their influence to psychologically control vulnerable people, often under the guise of therapy, education, or community development. Lisa's final report on the Hartwell case concluded with a warning that haunted her. The greatest threat to human freedom isn't always physical coercion or legal oppression. Sometimes it's the well-intentioned expert who believes they know better than you do who you should be, and who has the knowledge and authority to make that decision for you. In her nightmares, Lisa still saw the faces of the 7 missing students, their personalities erased and replaced with artificial contentment. They'd been rescued from Professor Hartwell's facility, but they'd never really be saved. The people they'd once been were gone forever, victims of a crime that society struggled to recognize or prosecute. The town of Hartwell eventually recovered from the scandal, but it never fully healed. Too many residents had been touched by Professor Hartwell's influence, their authentic selves lost to his vision of perfect social integration. They continued living their programmed lives, grateful for their transformation, and unaware of what they'd lost. Lisa often wondered how many other small towns harbored similar secrets, places where authority figures had decided that human individuality was a problem to be solved rather than a characteristic to be celebrated. The Hartwell case had taught her that the most insidious evil often wore a helping face and spoke in the language of care and concern. In her final journal entry about the case, Lisa wrote, "Professor Hartwell convinced an entire community that psychological autonomy was a luxury they couldn't afford, that true happiness came from perfect social integration. His victims thanked him for destroying their capacity for independent thought, and society celebrated him for solving the problem of human individuality. The real horror isn't that he did it, it's that so many people believed he was doing good." The Hartwell investigation remained officially closed, but Lisa knew the truth. Somewhere, another Professor Hartwell was probably perfecting his own methods of erasing inconvenient personalities, and another community was learning to mistake compliance for contentment, programming for peace. And there we have it, 5 journeys into the heart of small-town darkness, where the American dream becomes the American nightmare. What makes these stories so deeply disturbing isn't just the individual acts of violence or manipulation we've witnessed tonight. It's the systematic way entire communities can become corrupted, how good people can convince themselves that evil is necessary, even noble. In Millbrook, neighbors decided who deserved to live based on property values and noise complaints. In Clearwater, art became more important than human life. In Shepherd's Rest, survival justified consuming those who came to help. In Millfield, parents traded their children's souls for perfect behavior. And in Hartwell, education became indoctrination. Healing became destroying. Each of these communities found ways to rationalize the unthinkable. They created systems where murder, cannibalism, and psychological destruction were not just accepted, but celebrated as community traditions. The most chilling aspect isn't the crimes themselves, it's how ordinary people participated, how they convinced themselves they were doing good while perpetrating unimaginable evil. These stories serve as a reminder that evil rarely announces itself with horns and pitchforks. More often, it comes disguised as community improvement, artistic achievement, religious devotion, therapeutic healing, or academic progress. It speaks the language of good intentions while pursuing the darkest of goals. The next time you drive through a picture-perfect small town, past the white picket fences and church steeples, past the town squares where families gather and children play, remember the lessons of tonight's stories. Sometimes the most beautiful facades hide the ugliest truths. Sometimes the warmest welcomes come from the coldest hearts. And sometimes, the most dangerous question you can ask in a small town isn't, "What's your secret?" It's what happened to the people who asked too many questions. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the darkness that lurks beneath America's heartland. Sleep well, if you can. Until next time, remember, not all communities preserve what's worth keeping, and not all traditions deserve to survive.